Welcome to the Great Salt Lake Wetlands, History, Folklore, and Preservation. And we have a really great team of folks today. I'm going to pull out something if you haven't seen it. We'll be talking about this amazing issue from this year that was guest edited by Nichols, also with Jed Rogers. So our lineup today will be Jed talking a little bit about the Wetlands History Initiative, and then Jed will talk a little bit about the genesis of this great volume. Next will be Jack Ray and myself, Randy Williams, and then Andy Hedges will finish up. Each of us will tell a bit about ourselves when we present, and so I'm going to turn the time over to Jeff.
So I'm Jeff Nichols. I teach history at Westminster College. I was sort of trained as a social and cultural historian who's been trying to turn himself into an environmental historian for a while now. So this very much fits into that. This has been an interesting 5-6 years, very unusual experience, I think, for a historian. We're kind of famous for working in our little silos and our little archives. So this was another thing that began with kind of individual research and quickly became collaborative and has gone in a lot of interesting collaborative directions, and more collaboration to come, literally years more to come, I think it's safe to say. My involvement with the Great Salt Lake, such as it has been, began in 2012. So I attended the American Society for Environmental History conference, and a wonderful environmental historian named Nancy Langston was walking around with postcards, and she's with a conference announcement, and she's handing them out to people. And all she kept saying was, "It's in paradise, it's in paradise, it's in paradise, it's in paradise." And I'm looking at it, and it's this Portuguese name I'd never seen with tildes, and so it's I think it's Guimarães is the right way to pronounce it, which turns out to be this wonderful little UNESCO heritage site in northern Portugal. But I didn't know any of that, so I was trying to get together a panel to go and present with very little luck. Everyone I floated the idea to said, "Oh, overseas panels are expensive, and it's hard to get there, and it's too much work," and so no. It was a very long lead time. It was something like a 2-year lead time. So I could go to Plan B. So the first and arguably the most important collaboration was right on my campus with Dr. Bonnie Baxter, teaches biology, the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute, which is 10 years old this year, and her coordinator, her colleague in that work, Jamie Butler. So talking to them, and Bonnie is a great evangelist for the Great Salt Lake, if you know her at all. If she had her way, everyone in the world would work on the Great Salt Lake. So Bonnie and Jamie said, "Let's put together an all-Westminster panel on the Great Salt Lake." Sure, why not? And GSLI also said, hey, we can help get us there to Portugal, which was not a small consideration. Jamie's got a biology background. She's got a long history in working on the lake, including with brine shrimp folks. So we put together this all-Westminster panel. Jamie went. It turns out Bonnie was not able to go. My colleague in environmental studies, Brent Olson, who's a geographer, and recently retired biologist from Westminster named Judy Hall, and off we went. So we did. We proposed this. It was accepted. I wrote a paper about lake resorts at the time and the reasons for their popularity, the reasons for their decline, sort of making an argument saying it is mostly an environmental failure, both the movement of the lake and wind, and maybe most importantly, fire, as it turned out, was the worst environmental hazard. So we presented in Portugal in July 2014. Couple of us got invited to speak at a water history conference the next summer in Delft, Netherlands. So we're like, okay, that's not a bad gig either. So we went off and did that. So I was becoming kind of hooked on studying the the human history of the Great Salt Lake. In doing that work, I got interested in the history of duck hunting and proposed a paper about duck hunting for the Western History Association. In the course of that, again, lots of contacts, mostly through, beginning with GSLI, met Bob Barrett of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who was then the project leader at the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, and met Jack Ray, who is a Duck Club, a longtime Duck Club member and Duck Club historian. So I started talking to Bob Barrett, summer 2016, and Bob has since retired. Bob was always talking about putting the human element into the marshes. He says, we've got all kinds of, we've got materials, we've got people, we've got descendants of families, we've got retired folks here. There's a lot of that culture, of the records of that culture. So I presented on duck hunting, and I was sort of struck by how many people there seemed to be working on this. And I started thinking about getting a group of people together who worked on different aspects of Great Salt Lake history, and I had a very unformed, vague idea about a collaborative project. By coincidence, at virtually the same time, Bob Barrett sends kind of an overlapping email to some of the same people. This is December 2016. Some of the same people and some people that I didn't know, including Andy Hedges. And Bob, again, talked about the records, artifacts, the human historical resources, people like his friend Reese Beaton, who is the grandson of Market's duck hunters and duck club managers. So we had our first meeting, January 2017. Bob said, we can have it up here at the refuge. And the original group had, I think I've got these names right. We had Bob Barrett, we had some Weber State folks who we'll talk about in a second. Jack was there, Andy was there, Jamie Butler and myself. And we kicked around what we could possibly do with Great Salt Lake history. And I think Andy was the most ambitious. Says, we could have a symposium. We could write a book. What I didn't realize was you were writing a book. We could maybe a series of books. And I think the rest of us are like, hold on there. This is, we don't know what we're doing here yet. I floated a themed issue of the Utah Historical Quarterly before I had talked to anyone at the Utah Historical Quarterly. I said, well, let's float that idea towards them. But what gave us sort of an immediate focus, Jamie Butler, who is not a historian, asked this wonderfully naive question, but a very good question. He said, how do historians get their stuff? How do they get their records? How do they get their documents? And we all kind of looked at each other and made the silly jokes. It was like, well, your great aunt has a trunk in the attic, and you go through it and you find, an original Leonardo da Vinci or something. Otherwise we're waiting for people to go to archives and libraries and historical societies and offer those things. So among the others there, Sara Singh and Catherine McKay from Weber State talked about what they had done when they were writing about, they wanted to create an exhibit about 25th Street. And they put on, a public event. They advertised to the community. They asked people to come with, if they had documents, if they had artifacts, said we'll have special collections folks there, professionals can take the metadata, can scan things, can return them to you, or if you want to donate things, that's wonderful. And we can have oral historians there to take oral histories, to take stories. So a way to kind of proactively go out and seek things instead of waiting for it. So we thought, hey, that's a cool idea for us. Somewhere in there, it may have been the second or third meeting, we kind of realized we need a name to call ourselves. So the GSLI folks and Jamie Butler, they love these silly acronyms so that people can remember things. So we kicked this around, and the Wetlands History Initiative Project. WHIP, which don't think about that too hard because initiative and project kind of mean the same thing. So it's dopey, but it's quasi-memorable, and it's entirely unofficial. We never organized ourselves in any way, but we did indeed put on 3 of these sort of gathering events, one for each of the major rivers, the major wetlands. So the Bear River, we had the first one at the, we went from north to south at the refuge. And then we had one, the Weber-Ogden system in Ogden, and then one for the Jordan River in Salt Lake City at Westminster. And we had university librarians, special collections people, archivists, oral historians. At this point, we expanded also. We brought in, we contacted, Catherine and Sarah contacted Randy Williams and Todd Welch and Jennifer Duncan and other folks from Utah State. I think I got hold of Greg Thompson, Allison Albrader from the University of Utah became part of our group. And I talked to Jed, and Jed started meeting with us. After that first meeting at Bear River, through Jack Ray's contacts, we started meeting at the Ambassador Duck Club. So one of these clubs that some of these have been out there for many decades. These collecting events we had in the short run, on the face of it, were incredible busts. We got very few people show up. Handful of people would come, and those who would come were people that one or the other of us already knew, and they were sort of interested in it. But what it meant was we started immediately building this, or expanding, this network of contacts. You ought to talk to so-and-so. Do you know so-and-so is retired and still lives in Logan? Go talk to him. He worked at Bear River, worked wherever. And we did take some oral histories. Randy and Jack especially ran with this ball, took lots of oral histories. We got a little training. Greg Smoke at the American West Center and Leighton Quarles gave us some training in taking oral history. Jack, how many oral histories have you taken, do you think?
No, I don't know. I just do them in tournament.
You just do them in tournament. I don't keep track of them. Todd and Randy and others at Utah State created a digital archive of materials that we can add to, we can continue to go with. Several of us began writing articles for this issue that Jed's going to talk about for the quarterly. My original plan, I was going to write about market hunting, and then I decided we were a little duck hunting heavy, and I wasn't finding as many materials as I'd hoped to. So we had 3 pieces about ducks and duck hunting in one way or the other. I am going to present next month at the Western History Association about animal predator control at these refuges and others. The spoiler alert there is that they worry some about skunks and a lot about raccoons, and all of that is a minuscule amount of the attention they spend on plants, Phragmites especially, which seems to absorb most of their time and effort and money. Jed and I spoke briefly at Friends of Great Salt Lake, where we actually were approached by Glenda Cotter from the University of Utah Press, who kind of floated the idea at a lunch about a series of books about the Great Salt Lake, which if you stopped at the University of Utah table, you'll see there's a pretty shiny new press release. So Jed and I will be series editors for a series of books about the Great Salt Lake in many genres, in many fields. So if you have ideas about books that you would like to see that ought to be published about the Great Salt Lake, please come see us. So WHIP has turned out to be a very fruitful thing.
I first want to just thank Randy Williams for organizing this panel, for roping us all together. I'm kind of the odd person out because I actually didn't have a substantive piece or role beyond my normal duties in the quarterly, and so but I can kind of continue the timeline as Jeff has described it. But I just want to thank all of you who are presenting today for your contributions to this issue. I mean, they're excellent, excellent pieces of scholarship. Jeff for having the idea for initiating, seeing through a special issue in which you're the guest editor. It can inspire many of you others out there who would like to guest edit pieces, that's a possibility that we are definitely open to and that we do from time to time. I'm Jed Rogers. I'm one of the Utah Historical Quarterly editors, and I have been trained in environmental history, do a lot of Utah and Western history, but I try to always see those histories through an environmental lens. And so, as I was just thinking about future projects, I was always casting about for land and water ideas that could possibly pique my interest. And the Great Salt Lake, ever since moving here, I mean, I grew up in Utah, but I moved back 5 years ago, has been something of an interest of mine. So I'm really happy to be involved in all things Great Salt Lake. Jeff already described what happened to my... Okay, so Jeff already described a little bit of the origins of this particular issue. I see it as my role today to sort of talk a little bit about the process of making this happen, as well as some compelling reasons why I think we ought to pay attention to the lake and its edges. So I was at that's maybe the second or third meeting of this WHIP group at the Ambassador Duck Club, and that's where really we had where we issued a call for contributors. I remember, Andy, too, among your other ideas was to have a journal dedicated to edges, which is a really, really good idea that maybe could come to fruition at some point. But we had to start small with something that already exists with the Utah Historical Quarterly. So we issued a call for papers, we put it on listservs, and in late 2017, I believe, we issued an invitation for scholars to contribute to this particular issue. And obviously, because most of the contributors came from this WHIP group, we knew that the thematic focus was to be on the edges of the lake. And so what followed was the hard work of the authors doing the research, doing the writing, doing the interviewing, and sending us, Jeff and I, drafts of the pieces. We would come back with suggested edits, and we would have, in several cases, we would have several rounds of edits in some of the cases. And, again, among the other emphases of this particular issue, we have a lot on duck hunting, which we'll hear more about today. And I've been struck by the vitality and centrality of hunters and their clubs in engaging with their history. And it's been really fun to see them buy up all the extra copies of the journal, and that actually we only come with 5 copies that we have left that are available for folks, and I think Jack's already claimed them. So maybe it's time for a second printing of this particular issue. But I should also mention that, this was the first one that we've published with the University of Illinois Press. So we co-publish with Illinois. And so, yes, there were a bit of hiccups. So needless to say, the issue is the winter 2019 issue, but it didn't necessarily appear in winter. So that's that. I just wanted to continue and talk about in a few minutes compelling reasons why I think that edges is an important thematic focus, and something that we can think more about as those of us who are doing research on the Great Salt Lake continue to think about this particular area. I think that edges helps us to think about the micro and macro histories of the lake. You can think about the long-term processes at work, and also the short, compressed timescales that many of us as historians tend to operate in. And it allows us to think about, on a very local level, what it is that's unique about this place. Joseph Amato writes in his book, Rethinking Home, "The history of one place is never quite that of another place. What we cherish is not theory and generalization, but difference and differentiation." And I think that as I think about the lake and its edges, I tend to think about, what is its uniqueness in the American West, and how does it broadly fit into the major themes of the American West and of Utah history. Just a quick comment on large-scale natural forces at work. Of course, the major universities in this state and many of our neighborhoods lie on an ancient lake bed, which Lake Bonneville, which remnants of Lake Bonneville, tectonic forces and erosional wind and water have created the mountains that give the Wasatch Front its name. So we might think of the benchlands, we might think of these mountains as static forms, but among the many insights of environmental history, of the natural sciences, certainly, is this idea that nature is dynamic, it's continually evolving and interacting with the anthropic world, and it's something that we ought to continue to think about as historians. And then as we're thinking about compressed timescales, I think about all the major changes that have occurred at this water body over the last two centuries. One of our contributors who's not here, Michael McLean, has indicated that he writes about these. Sorry, it's not. I'm not sure why it's not showing up. How do I? How about this? Okay. Okay, here's Lake Bonneville. And Michael McLean has indicated, in his piece in the Utah, in the Quarterly, that there are many of these lost lakes, like Hot Springs Lake, Williams Lake, Cohen's Slough, that in the 19th century there was this watery landscape. The Jordan River and the marshlands around it were fed by these mountain streams. And now this landscape has largely been engineered. The marshlands have been drained, of course, and the water feeding down from the mountains has largely been diverted into culverts and pipelines. And I think that thinking about how the landscape has been engineered really changes the way we can think about the lake and what it means to us. One thing that Jack mentions in his piece that maybe he'll talk about is that duck clubs that remain are some of the last bastions of preservation of the marshlands on which transnational birds rely. And I'm not sure what's going on with this. Apologize. And then consider, too, the matrix of land ownership along the lake's edges. Of the lake's shoreline is privately and publicly owned. Thinking of private duck clubs, of course, but and their land possessions. Think of U.S. Magnesium. Think of state lands. The map on the top comes from U of U Special Collections. One of their collections that they have, indicating on the southern shore some of the land ownership claims. And on the bottom, picture of colleague and friend Ari, and we're trying to trace some of the original route of Hastings Cutoff and traverse it by foot across the salt desert. But of course, we run into some issues, like a fence which delineates the southern side with the northern portion, which is a military range, bombing range, or military range. And then, of course, there's the Newfoundland evaporation pond, which was created in the 1980s as kind of excess overflow during the floods during that period, which also creates obstacles to and presents new edges, new boundaries of this landscape. And the lake's shoreline, of course, has always been in flux, marked by wet and dry periods. Here's a chart showing lake levels up into the 1940s. I think this appears in Dale Morgan's book on the Great Salt Lake. And you can see that there's this fluctuation. Maybe you've seen recent Tribune articles on, for example, fencing along the southern edge of Antelope Island to keep bison out away from our cities, from having them venture in. Another one of a U of U atmospheric science professor who rode his bike months on end along the dry lake bed, and he was tracking sort of soil conditions along the lake to see what the impacts of that soil, if it's kicked up into the atmosphere, what would that have on our air quality problems here in the valley. And then, of course, there have been wet periods as well. And this is an image from the mid-1980s. And so we've always had this dynamic water line where the water is ebbing and flowing, where fresh and salt water mix, and where some plants and animals thrive, where industry and recreation abound. the articles in this special issue, I think, highlight this dynamic. They introduce new characters and events that will broaden the circle of how we understand this water body and its place in the American West. I brought with me, we've had traditional scholarship. 30 years ago, the Utah Historical Quarterly published a special issue on the Great Salt Lake, and I brought extra copies of this if anyone would like some. Feel free, but we've also had works like Del Morgan's The Great Salt Lake, published in 1947, and these have traditionally focused on, historic trails, federal exploration, American perceptions of the lake, artistic representations of the lake, and I think that those are important to highlight. But I'm grateful for the work of the scholars here in highlighting new stories that hadn't yet been considered in the scholarship. And also give a shout out to Chris Merritt and to Ari Leaflane for their piece in the quarterly, as well as Bo Burgess in sharing at the last page of the quarterly one of his images from his postcard and photograph collection on recreation on the southern shore of the lake. So with that, I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right. My name is Jack Ray, and I am someone who's been interested in the marshes, and I'm the president of the Utah Waterfowl Association and the chair of the Great Salt Lake Alliance. And I've been involved in Great Salt Lake issues for many, many years. For me, it all started when I was a teenager, and my friends and I, on Saturdays, would drive out to Farmington Bay Waterfowl Management Area and go duck hunting. And at the end of a day of duck hunting, we carried all of our stuff out in like 6-gallon buckets. And so at the end of the day, the sun set, the shooting's closed, we would sit on our buckets in the middle of the water, and as the horizon turned orange and that reflected off the water and the water was orange, the sky would fill with ducks and their whistling wings would be streaming past our heads in just the spectacle of nature. And for me, I think that's kind of where my heart became connected to the Great Salt Lake. And over time, I've begun to wonder why we even have a Great Salt Lake anymore. If you look at the history of terminal basins, terminal lakes, saline lakes around the world, it's not a positive history. The Aral Sea is basically just a shadow of its former self. It's lost over 90% of its surface area. Lake Urmia, about the size of the Great Salt Lake originally in Iran, a huge important saline lake, again down to less than 10% of its original size. Owens Lake in California, completely dewatered, and California has been spending billions of dollars trying to solve the dust problem that has now arisen from the fact that the lake is desiccated. Salton Sea is in the process of dying, and that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar project just to try to save a small portion of that. And so why, in the second driest state in the nation, do we have a terminal lake that still exists? It's struggling, it's under threat. But why do we still have it after all of the development, agricultural, urban, and otherwise, that has occurred along the margins of the Great Salt Lake? Why does that ecosystem still exist? And so I'd like to talk about one of the reasons for that today, and what happened over 100 years ago that saved a large part of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem so that we have something left to fight over today. And now we have to save the lake about every 3 years, I think. Kind of what it's come to. But back in the late 1800s, there was an increasing interest in duck hunting on the Great Salt Lake. So even back into the 1860s, people would talk about finding, good sport in shooting up by Corinne or in other places. And people would sell ducks, and it was mostly at that point in time a way to make a living. People would sell ducks on the market in Salt Lake City. They would ship, once the rail line came through, of course, they started shipping ducks back to Chicago and to Points East, and it became a huge market. And there was a saying in the papers that once ducks came onto the market, during the times of year when they were marketed, the market for chicken kind of dried up because people enjoyed eating ducks so much. And even though ducks may have been a little bit more expensive, at some point the market would become flooded, but people would go out and they would go out duck hunting and then sell the ducks. And there were people who were professional market hunters, and then there were people who were recreational but used, they sold their excess ducks on the market and defrayed the cost of their recreation. But as this was developing, as time was progressing through the late 1800s and into the very early 1900s, the interest became so intense over time that people started realizing that, hey, in addition to making a buck off of selling these ducks on the market, I can also make a buck off of charging access to the land and water where these ducks reside. And so landowners started charging fees, for access. There was a landowner up in the Bear River area in 1892 who was charging hunters up there $10 a season, basically for a season pass on his property at the mouth of the Bear River at that time. And duck camps started springing up, and there was a famous duck camp up, again, on the Bear River area run by a gentleman named Vincent Davis, who patented land up there under the Desert Land Act, I believe. And he established a duck camp in the 1890s, and people would come from around the country increasingly to go hunting at his property. And now we're going to test my limited technological skills here. How do I get to the next one? That's why I brought a visual aid. Because knowing how poor I am at anything technology, so I brought an old, these are called silhouette duck decoys, and they would have been set on the ice or in a field in order to attract ducks. There we go. Oh, that one? Okay. So, in any event, so jumping ahead a little bit, Moon Silver and Hunter Lakes. Does anyone know where Moon Silver and Hunter Lakes? Has anyone been to Moon Silver and Hunter Lakes? So you have? Pardon? So these are now a golf course, and they're surrounded by industrial development. And a lot of people don't know, but there were a lot of lakes like this back in the late 1800s and early 1900s that were all eventually drained over time. And so ducks that didn't come under the control and the ownership of duck clubs, by and large, were all drained. There was Williams Lake that would talk about how when passengers would drive the train out to Saltaire and go by Williams Lake, the train would stir up the ducks, and people would be amazed at what they referred to as the vast hordes of waterfowl that would come up. Williams Lake is now under the Salt Lake Airport. Hot Springs Lake has already been mentioned. And so duck clubs started forming in the very late 1800s. This is the Black Sloughs Duck Club. And about half of it was taken over by the airport back in about 1990. But it goes back to 1898. And there's an impression that a lot of duck clubs were sort of the haunt of, wealthy people, people who had a lot of money and who had a lot of resources. But a lot of these clubs were just basically people who just wanted to go out and have a place to hunt. So after the duck clubs sprang up, like the Davis Club that I mentioned up on Bear River Bay, a lot of hunters said, you know what? It might be a good idea if we just bought this land ourselves or leased it ourselves, and then we would have exclusive access and know that when we went up there we would have a place to hunt. And so duck clubs started springing up in the late 1800s around the Great Salt Lake. The first one mentioned was about 1892 at the mouth of the Jordan River. And it mentions that they were going to be hiring guards to keep people off the property, and they were going to build a clubhouse. And most of the clubhouses, when you think of a clubhouse, this was the standard issue clubhouse for a South Shore Duck Club back in the early 1900s. So there was nothing fancy. It was basically a bunkhouse and a stove and, probably an outhouse. And the most exciting thing is that they would train their dogs to climb the ladders. But in any event, and this is, by the way, this is out at the Rudi Duck Club, and this is an old boathouse. And you can actually see that the thing leaning up there is actually an old push pole. Through the shallow waters, they would need to use push poles to push themselves through the mud and the water, and so that push pole is about 10 or 12 feet long. But this is just an old, they would keep the boat in the back, and they would have a little area to warm up in the front. So this is the inside of a boathouse that dates back many, many years. You can see the duck decoys hanging up, and there's no return boat there. But the clubs, some of the clubs were a little bit better off. In fact, some of them were a lot better off. And so the Bear River Club formed in 1901 up at the mouth of the Bear River, and they purchased the land from Vincent Davis, who I mentioned. And it eventually has grown to 12,000 acres, but the club would employ all kinds of people, and they would take people down the river, down the Bear River in their boats, and then they would come stay at the lodge, which in 1901 was a heated lodge with private hot and cold water to each of the rooms of the members. They brought a phone line in. So for 1901, in the middle of an otherwise inaccessible marsh, this was a pretty amazing thing. And people would come from the local communities and want to go on boat rides just to see the Great Bear River Club Marsh. But all of these clubs wound up acquiring and establishing wetland areas of about a total of about 40,000 acres plus around the margins of the Great Salt Lake, mostly concentrated at the south end and at the north end. And the clubs would actually build dikes and impound additional areas so that there was a lot more habitat than when they started out. But this created contention because people who didn't belong to a club then felt like they had no place to go hunt. And so there were a number of disputes that would arise as a result of that, because the clubs would hire guards and they would control access. And so a number of lawsuits actually arose beginning in the early 1900s and extending through the mid-19-teens, where duck hunters, duck clubs would try to seek an injunction against the trespassers on their property. The duck clubs would seek injunctions. And as a result of that, the clubs won all of those lawsuits uniformly. And so all of the courts held that the duck clubs had the right to control access to their property. And the significance of that is because the duck clubs had the right to control access to their property, they had an incentive to preserve it in its, more or less natural state as habitat. If there had been open access, of course, they wouldn't have been spending the money to preserve habitat for somebody else. Most importantly, from the Great Salt Lake's perspective, is it also provided an incentive for the duck clubs to hold and to maintain considerable water rights. And living in an era now where the Great Salt Lake is basically, struggling to get enough water, those water rights have become critically important on both the north end and the south end of the lake in terms of preserving those habitats. So because the duck clubs won those access battles back in the very early 1900s, they were able to preserve that 40,000 acres. They were able to preserve the water rights, and they were also able to preserve the habitat downstream from them in the lake where the overflow water then flowed. If they had lost those battles, all of that would have evaporated, and they probably would have wound up like Williams Lake and Hot Springs Lake and everything else. The other thing this did is, at the same time that these legal battles were all being decided in favor of the duck clubs, the state then saw that they needed to provide opportunity for the public hunters, and so they started acquiring and establishing waterfowl management areas. They first authorized the establishment of waterfowl management areas around 1913, and the first one was established in the 1920s called the Public Shooting Grounds, 12,000 acres. And then over the course of the next years, there were probably about another 40 or 50,000 acres of state waterfowl management areas that were preserved as a result of that. In addition to that, the state also pushed the federal government to establish a bird refuge in Bear River Bay. When people would go to Bear River Bay in the very early 1900s, and it's interesting, you can look at the reports of old trappers, you can look at the reports from the Fremont expedition, and up through newspaper reporters into the very early 1900s, they would speak in amazement about going out on Bear River Bay and seeing clouds of waterfowl rise up off the water so vast that it sounded like, thunder or a freight train coming down the tracks even from a mile or two away. And there was an understanding even back then that they needed to preserve these areas. And by the way, tell me when I could run on forever. Poor people, tell me when to shut up. So, and so they pushed the federal government to preserve Bear River Bay. And so as a result of that, over 100,000 acres of marshland was preserved in state and federal waterfowl management areas. in the second driest state in the nation. I mean, it's remarkable when you think about it. In the same area where you have a concentration of human development and a concentration of agricultural need, you also have a very conservative state, a pro-development state, setting aside tens of thousands of acres as wildlife habitat along with the associated water rights. And so the result of this is that we now have ringing the eastern shore of the lake basically not quite unbroken, but a nearly unbroken succession of duck clubs and waterfowl management areas preserving the richest parts of the habitat around the Great Salt Lake. So this is the way they would hunt back then, and that would be a blind. And then, you know, people have visions of these beautifully carved wooden decoys and everything, but the water, as you can see, is only like an inch or two deep. And so if you're rowing a boat, you know, or trying to push a boat across a couple of inches of water, you don't want to, you know, have any more weight in it than you needed. So they would just take a shovel out and turn over these mounds of mud, and those work just fine as decoys. This was the boat that the Bear River Club used to ferry its guests from Corinne down to the club. And these would have been residents of Corinne and Brigham City who were going on a tour down to the Bear River Club. And that boat was named after Dorothy, the daughter of A.J. Bigelow, who ran a bank in Ogden. So this would have been by the Bear River Club, and then they had these specially designed light, shallow boats because they had in addition to being in the channel, they were basically mud sleds for pushing the boats across the mud. And then these are buildings that would have been at the Bear River Club and Duckville, another club down in that area. This is the club membership card of Gustav Becker, who had a brewery in Ogden. And then he belonged to several clubs. These are the esteemed guides of the Bear River Club.
Are you in there?
So, Craig Dangerfield is in there. But this is Vincent Davis, who was he was considered one of the best shots in the wing shots in the country. He once shot 94 teal with 97 shots, which is pretty amazing. And that's Vincent Davis there holding the shotgun. That's a Browning designed shotgun. So, and John Browning, by the way, and his brother both belong to the Bear River Duck Club. This is what's called the Mud Queen, getting across. When they got tired of pushing boats, somebody in the era of engines and automobiles thought, why don't we essentially create an automobile that will go across these areas? And so they took an old Model A engine, put big metal paddle wheels where the wheels would have gone, and that would go across the mud at something like 20 miles an hour. And then in the 1980s, the floods came, and this is the old Duckville clubhouse, which Duckville was right next to the Bear River Club, but had counted among its members a number of movie stars and different people. But in the 1980s, they were unable to protect the clubhouse from the floods, and so the ice basically sheared the club. This is the Davis Duck Camp that was established around 1890, and this picture would have been just a few years after that. And so Vincent Davis was already charging people to come hunt at his property at the mouth of the Bear River back in that era. And so there is an interior marsh in Indiana and Illinois called the Grand Kankakee, and it was about 500,000 acres in size, 600,000 acres in size. And it was drained beginning right after the Civil War. And the newspapers in Salt Lake City lamented the loss of that marsh and the great duck shooting that it provided. And in more modern times, people researching that have determined that the drainage of that 500,000 acre marsh area, in the Mississippi Flyway, probably reduced the total migratory bird population in North America by 20%. The Great Salt Lake is probably, from a bird perspective, the most critical geographic feature between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. And we have basically that lake ecologically intact, struggling, but ecologically intact today, in some measure due to people like these who didn't really know what they were doing at the time, But because they were buying up all of these lands and securing all of these water rights, and then pushing the state to set aside land and to establish waterfowl management areas, you know, we now have this today, and we now have areas where we can still go out and be amazed, like I was as a teenager, at the birds, you know, filling the skies, and know that, you know, it's still, you know, serving its ecological purpose, the same ecological function that it served, you know, 500 years ago. It's still serving today. Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, I'm going to follow along with Jack and talk a little bit about the Bear River Duck Club, specifically Craig Dangerfield, who is in the audience. Thank you very much for coming today. And he will be at the back telling you things that I got wrong. I really appreciate Craig. Utah State participated in the first collecting day, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that process. But I first want to talk to you just briefly about something called Northern Utah Speaks. It's something we do at Utah State University to try to bring in community-driven ethnographies to help, as Jeff mentioned, you know, where do you get this stuff? And one of the ways, and probably one of the most important ways in the very beginning, is from the people who experience it firsthand. And we work to amplify, not only preserving the voices, but amplify it. And so I do appreciate Jeff and Jed giving Utah State the opportunity to amplify voice in that collection, Craig Dangerfield's voice in the issue. This doesn't work. Okay, I'll come back over here. So this idea of archival documents in history is a key way, and I feel like one of the most important pieces, I feel like, of the work that I've done in my career is about social justice, allowing all the voices. And it's difficult because obviously in an archive we don't know all the voices, but we're trying to do better. And one of the ways we do that is through autonomy, working with communities to help them tell their stories. And not them, you know, like the ideas coming from us, but a lot of times the ideas coming organically from a community. And so I really do want to say again thank you to Craig, because he was such a collaborative partner in the article and everything that I have done. So Utah State University partnered in. We came a little bit into the WIP program, but on the 6th of May in 2017, we met with folks that were willing to self-designate that they had something to share. Some of them brought in photographs. Some of the photographs that I think Jack shared came from up at Utah State, but these were from people in the community, and what they came with not only is the picture or the duck decoy or the oral history, but the metadata, information behind it, so we could understand that more fully. And along with Craig, we had, as was mentioned, Reese Beaton and other folks that came and participated. And we do have a Great Salt Lake Wetlands history project up at Utah State that has these oral histories and the scans, and including some of these amazing Duck Club ledgers and a really great representation. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is a master guide. I'm a folklorist. I don't pretend to be a historian. I think occasionally some of the reviewers from the journal were like, what's up with her? I'm not a historian, and I kept saying I'm not a historian, I'm a folklorist. But when Jeff and I had the opportunity to be in the room with Craig and Julie Dangerfield, I was like, okay, this is an important voice. And the reason being is he is living that tradition. I'm not going to talk a lot about the rise of guides because Jack did a beautiful job, but just know that after, around the Civil War time, a lot of these private lands became owned by others, and people that had the history, that were living and using hunting and doing a variety of backwoods lifestyles were removed from those lands. And there became a rise to a need for a guide on those lands. And others have written beautifully about this. But I think that there is a long tradition of this, and Craig fits into that tradition. He knows, and he talked in his interview about the work that the duck clubs, similar to what Jack was talking about, helping finance things through stamps and through a variety of things. And my husband and I had the opportunity to go out with Craig and some of his colleagues to do renesting. And so it's huge work that the duck hunters are doing. And it's a lot of times you don't know that until you interact with someone like Craig Dangerfield. So I'm going to tell you my lens. I'm coming as a folklorist, and so what I'm looking at is work culture. and looking at the context and the text. And the text would be the interview, but also the context and the function and the performance of that. And not the performance in the way like a play, but the performance of those work skills. And so folklorists do look at occupational folklore. We investigate this important expressive culture. And a lot of times we are unaware of that. And that's, again, why we need a docent. The thing that struck me about Craig Dangerfield was these twin skills. He could navigate with some, nobodies, Jeff and I, but who he had to really mostly navigate with the folks at the Bear River Duck Club, the people who understand, and both the client and also the other Duck Club guides. And so I'll just let you know there are lots of narrator types, but when you're doing oral history, a lot of times you're going to find somebody with a finished narrative. They're not actively engaged in something any longer. They know the history of it, and that's so important. But then when you're so lucky, you get this active storyteller, a tradition bearer like Craig, who is still honoring that tradition, and it's alive for him, and he knows it's changing, and he's able to speak to those changes. So I'd like to just briefly share with you a few of the motifs that I found with Craig's interviews. And it seems, I have to say this, I told Craig earlier, usually I'm far away at a conference. Although Andy and I are like, what's up with us not getting invited to Barcelona? We didn't know about that. We would have gone. But,
Didn't know you.
yeah, you didn't know us then. But these motifs that are, usually I'm presenting and talking about these kinds of things away at a conference. And so I'm so honored that Craig and Julie are here today to keep me on my toes. So one of the things that was so amazing was learning about the lineage, the genealogy that Craig comes into duck hunting. Now that doesn't mean that Craig couldn't have learned that later on in life, but he has a deep-seated connection, and he tells a story about his first hunt that is so powerful and moving. And I know you can't read all this in the 1/2 second I'm going to put it up there. So you really do need to read the journal, if only to read the beautiful lyrical voice of Craig Dangerfield, talking about the first duck hunt and what he did and how he went home and drew that animal or that bird. And really, his mother cooked it for him. This connection to the place, the space, the experience, and his love of it is just eloquent. I feel like Craig's a little bit of a poet in some ways, the way he uses words. And I'm sure that is partly because of being a guide. There's a lot that goes into that. So for him, it was a dream come true, being able to connect and get a position at the Bear River Duck Club, which some folks call the Millionaire Club. As Jack noted, many wealthy people are members there. Not only who's who in Utah, but also in Hollywood, in politics, and in government, and business. But he talks about going out. And so all of these motifs are peppered by a story. And that's something that's very traditional and typical of an amazing storyteller or a tradition bearer, a live tradition bearer. And he does talk about this opportunity that he got to go out and meet and get into the tradition. And this culture is so amazing. I felt real honored to have had a peek into the waterfowl culture and to learn not only from Craig, but from Jeff and Jack and others about this culture. And then the other collections we have at Utah State. So you might be interested in this as well, know as little or less than or more than I do. We have throughout the state, at Westminster and at Utah State, these beautiful collections that talk about this opportunity. And this example that Craig I'm sharing here is him telling a little bit about an older gentleman at the club and how he was always sort of kind of a little bit, if I can say the word bossy, wanting Craig to do it his way. And eventually the head duck guide said, you know what, you've really got to, you can't be pulling up and moving around and doing constantly changing. And so Craig finally, said to Mr. B, we're going to have to do it my way. And they ended up being quite good friends, and he always requested Craig. But it's like any job. You've got to learn where your place is in that. And Craig shows through his narratives this occupational experience. And I think any of us, we know a little bit about hunting, but gear for many occupations is very important. And understanding the gear and being able to use it correctly is a hallmark of a skilled expert. And this was probably my favorite story. I have to tell you that when we were doing the interview, Jeff and I, Julie and Craig, Abby Craig's amazing hunting dog was there sitting quietly. And this story about the sad death of another hunting dog within 6 weeks of the opening. And if you don't have a hunting dog, as a guide, you just don't have a job. That's just part of your toolkit. And talking about how he got a dog from somebody up in Heber who had been trained to be a bomb-sniffing dog. But because of the snipers finding these dogs and knowing what they were doing, this dog was almost finished being trained, and Craig and Julie flew up there, saw this dog, and were just amazed. And I have to say, I think Julie is in love with Abby as Craig. So I think she might sleep in the house, unlike other dogs. But a guide, I'm telling you about things you might already know about, but think about a guide. You've got to be an expert storyteller because you're in you're in a boat or in a blind for hours upon hours. You've got to know more than just how to do this, to shoot birds, basically. You've got to entertain someone. And so I was like, I could totally see the beauty of the storytelling. And I have to tell you, don't be offended. A numbskull's tail is a traditional motif in folklore. People look at them and you think of Jack and the Beanstalk. But a numbskull tail is usually somebody that by luck and some wit and just a dumb luck sometimes succeeds. And this story tells about some older duck hunters finishing up. And I believe this duck hunter had boat 1, which is pretty prestigious. And Craig's boat, he said at the time, was like 394. And so this guy is, pretty up there. But he was a little bit buzzed, and it was their story of basically pushing a car down the freeway using the motor of a airboat. So can you imagine? People are calling the police and saying, there's an airplane on the freeway, and all these freaking out. But this story punctuates so beautifully the ingenuity of duck hunters, the ingenuity of folks, but also this motif that folklorists look at, this numbskull story. So this interaction of personal narrative and the Great Salt Lake wetlands is huge. This narrative and others that we collected tell the history of the wetlands. Jack Ray has worked on telling the story of the duck clubs. Others, like Andy and Michael, are telling other pieces of the wetlands. But all these stories fitting together help give the bigger picture. I always say it's like a mosaic. The small little pieces in a mosaic, those tessera, that whole big picture tells it. And we can't leave out voices. And if we're leaving out, I'd like to sit down with somebody that was doing some of the cooking at the duck clubs and other folks. And we'll continue to flesh this out. The native story. So there is an uncertain future. I think that we've talked a little bit about that, not just with the water, but also with duck hunting. I am 58 years old, and that is the median age of duck hunters today. And so Craig talks about that and talks about what they are doing and the boards he's been on. Talking about the legacy of the duck hunting. I love Jack starting out his presentation about being a boy walking out there, and Craig talks about that. Walking out in leaky boots, the decoys that they would have, this visceral image that their stories create for us to understand, why this is important and why this heritage is important. And so I have to say thank you to Craig Dangerfield and others that participated in our project, who were willing to share with us their story. And also share the importance of this to their families, to friends, and those, in Craig's case, at the Bear River Duck Club. And my hat's off to you, Craig. You're keeping a tradition alive. So thank you.
All right. I want to thank those who've already presented. These are very interesting things, I think. My name's Andy Hedges. I teach religion down at BYU. Why I'm involved with this, I think there's 2 reasons. This is what you get to do after you get tenure. You have a little freedom. And I think they needed a spiritual advisor for this particular group. I somehow got designated. I've totally failed. But it's been a lot of fun to do this. I'm also going to talk about the Bear River Marsh. Some interesting history there. Along the entire eastern side of the Great Salt Lake, you've got a lot of marshes where the Jordan River comes in, and the Weber River, and the Bear, and there's a lot of wetlands, but I think the gem of them is Bear River Bay and the Bear River Marsh. If you look back in the history, this is the one that certainly gets the most press. Jack talked about the hunting there, which was just world renowned, late 19th, early 20th century. But there was a problem that emerges as everybody is killing some people, thousands of ducks. Somebody like Vincent Davis, thousands of ducks in a season. But people start noticing that towards the end of the summer, most years, or at least a lot of years, you start finding dead ducks. This is before anybody's shooting them, just hundreds of them. The first real account we have, 1896. Some guides who were just out messing around in the marsh, getting ready for the hunt, pick up 400 mallards that were either dead or in the last stages of life. And everybody's kind of wondering what's going on. And just kind of every year, towards late summer, you would get these die-offs. And it just seemed like, kind of a weird thing, just sort of a peculiar feature of the marsh, nothing really to get too concerned about. Until the year 1910. 1910 hits, and there are tens of thousands of dead birds. Now, this is taken at the mouth of the Weber River. If you look in the background there, you're kind of looking up Weber Canyon. You've got Mount Ogden to the left there. But this is just looking out there, and most of those birds are either dead or dying. And everybody's kind of wondering what's going on. Estimates ranged, nobody did a formal count, but somewhere between 200,000 birds along all of the marshes. That was one estimate I found. The highest estimate, somebody went as far as to say they were estimating 3 million ducks had died on the Bear River Marsh alone. Just killed over. And nobody's quite sure what's going on. People stopped hunting. They were afraid, is there some disease that we're going to bring into our families? 1910, very little hunting and just lots and lots of concern. Clears up later on in the fall, but 1911 happens again, 1912, 1913. 1913, workers at the Bear River Club, that's been mentioned already, picked up and disposed 46,700 ducks. They would bury them in pits, they would burn them, and they estimated that was probably less than 20% of those that had actually died. And so again, well over 200,000 right there. This still happens today. This is botulism. What's going on is botulism. This is a toxin produced by anaerobic bacteria. People are still trying to figure out all of the pathways that the birds ingest the toxin. This is an ongoing concern with wild waterfowl management today. 1997, just to let you know how bad this can still be today, the bird refuge, Bear River Bird Refuge, disposed of 84,000 dead ducks the late summer and fall of 1997. They estimated that 400,000 had died on the refuge alone. It was bad elsewhere too. That year, looking just at North America, Canada, and the United States, managers estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.6 million ducks died from botulism. We know that now. We know what the disease is. They didn't know it back in 1910 and 1911 and 1912. Nobody had any clue. There were lots of ideas what it might be, cholera, or some sort of poisoning from some other source, but nobody really was sure on that. And so, what the Biological Survey, this is the forerunner to the Fish and Wildlife Service, they hear about this. They're back in Washington, D.C., but these marshes are so well known, they hear about this pretty quickly. And they send out a young scientist named Alexander Wetmore. Here he is, 28 years old, working on his master's degree. And he's an employee. And they send him out. He'd already done a fair amount of field work. He'd been up in the Aleutian Islands. He'd been in Puerto Rico studying birds. And they say, hey, go figure out what's going on. Don't let the humble clothing deceive you here. This is the future secretary of the Smithsonian Institution that we're looking at right here, getting his start. He's holding a mallard in his right hand and a cinnamon teal in his left hand. They look dead. They're not dead. They're just in the last stages of botulism. One of the names for botulism, one of the names they used was limber neck, because it's the muscles, it causes paralysis of the muscles. And as the muscles paralyze, the birds just lose all muscular control. They either die from asphyxiation, because they can't breathe, that takes muscles, or if they're on the water, their heads would sink under the surface of the water and they would drown. And so these two are actually alive, but obviously not looking really good. And Wetmore comes out trying to figure out what is going on. He sets up shop in the Duckville Gun Club right by the Bear River Refuge today. This is the original duck club right here. Jack has told me, helped me understand that this one actually burned down. The picture he had that the ice was destroying, that was the second one. This is the original. So they let him, the duck clubs are interested in what's going on. They want him to figure out, what the problem is here. So they give him room and board essentially. And then the Bear River Club rents a little ground where they set up, this is what's called a research station. In the 1916, this is what a research facility looked like. He's holding if you zoomed in on that, in his left hand he's got another duck. I found it impossible to find a picture of Wetmore without a duck somewhere in the picture during this time. He's a tall, lanky guy. He's 6'3", probably about 140 pounds, and he just loved to carry ducks. So he sets up shop and then starts gathering birds, just walking through the marsh, gathering birds. Some of these are dead, some of these are alive. He had some help, a lot of people wanting to know exactly what is going on with this. He spends 3 summers out there, 1914 to 1916, the summers, just researching and trying to figure out everything. What he does is he's advancing waterfowl science. I don't know if he fully knew it, but at the time, science was kind of wrapped up with just classifying flora and fauna, just trying to get their arms around the different, the number of species and the different kinds of animals around. And he did a little bit of that during his career, but here he's bringing in observation and hypothesis and experimentation. And he kind of introduces and injects the scientific method into the study of waterfowl at the time. It's a huge leap forward. And he goes about trying to figure things out. Now, he totally fails. That's the great part of this. After 3 summers, he says, I know what it is. I know what the problem is. It's alkaline poisoning. You've got all these salts, the Great Salt Lake, different kinds of alkaloid salts, and he says they're just concentrations too strong, and that's what's killing these birds. Totally missed botulism. Totally wrong on that. But the methodology that he introduced of observation and hypothesis and experimentation, others pick this up after he moves on to greener pastures, and eventually we do figure out, through the methodology that he introduces, we are able to figure out that this was botulism. Maybe more important than figuring out what it was is, even though he misunderstood the cause, he did figure out a cure. He said, you know what, if you can get these birds to fresh water, 90% of them recover. Even these ones that are hanging limp in your hands. Get them to fresh water, and in a very short time, they're fine again, and they're able to fly off. And that's still today one of the best defenses against botulism when you have these outbreaks right here. Another thing that he does is he wanted to see, is recovery, is it complete? Or do they just temporarily get better and then die, 3 weeks later? And so to do that, he put bands, aluminum bands, on the legs of these ducks. And this is a picture of him releasing a drake pintail that he's brought back from the dead, essentially, put a band on it, and he's now casting his bird in the air and see where it ends up. And when these bands are recovered, usually through a hunter, then you can see, they have numbers on them. And the biological survey kept a record of all of these. And if a hunter finds a band or shoots a bird with a band on it, you send it into DC, and they can tell you when that bird was banded and where and things like that. And so, a few years down the road, he starts getting these band returns indicating that birds that had been on the brink of death with botulism lived another 3 or 4 years before they were actually shot, and may have lived a lot longer than that as well. And so this is kind of an outgrowth of the whole thing. But this is where waterfowl start getting banded in large numbers. People had banded birds, for years before this, but Wetmore does it large scale and has the full force of the U.S. government behind it as well. And we start banding water, which of course is a huge ongoing thing today. And it allows us, one of the neat things it does, Jack made the point that from a bird's perspective, Great Salt Lake area, these marshes are probably the most important place between the Pacific Ocean and the Mississippi. We learned that through banding studies. And you see where these birds go and the reach here. And we've learned through some of his and subsequent banding studies that you take the United States, waterfowl managers divide the United States up into 4 flyways, they call them, migration pathways. You've got the Pacific, the Central, the Mississippi. I should go the other way for you guys. The Pacific, the Central, the Mississippi, and then the Atlantic. Well, birds from the Bear River Marsh, we feed into 3 of those flyways, the Pacific, the Central, and as weird as it sounds, the Atlantic flyway. Redheads, a species of duck, raised on the Bear River Marsh, end up on the Atlantic coast. And you get a sense here of the continental influence of the marshes here on the Great Salt Lake, how important they are. And so Wetmore puts the Bear River Marsh on the map in ways that hunting did not. Hunting certainly put it on the map in a lot of ways, but he brings science to it. And with the science, it's kind of a whole different aspect, a whole different angle of looking at things. And it is, his studies here are one of the big reasons that eventually we do, along with the duck hunting, one of the big reasons we are able to get the Bear River Bird Refuge established. People start seeing how important this place is on a continental scale to waterfowl. Thank you very much.
Well, you've noticed we saved questions for last, and so if you have any questions for Jeff or Jed, Jack, myself, or Andy, we'd love to have them. Yes, sir.
I think it's a question probably for Jack. And I want to know a little bit about the nature of the water rights that are held by the duck clubs and their security. I mean, obviously they go back to the early 20th or late 19th century, so they're not in-stream flow claims. So there's got to be some kind of beneficial use argument attached to them, or is that necessarily true or not?
Yeah, with each club, depending on when they acquired the water rights, has a different priority date. Some of them are some of the oldest water rights in our various drainages. Some of them are newer, and so they're not as strong. And some of them, so before there was prior appropriation, there was, establishing a water right under the current system, there was what were called diligence claims. And so many of them were established through diligence claims and then some after that. So it just varies. It's kind of all over the place.
And are there ongoing threats to those claims, did you see, with the expansion of metropolitan areas and greater demand for those waters?
Well, yeah, I mean, development and urbanization pose a significant problem. But one of the, one of the reasons, it kind of all relates to like Andy's presentation and some of the others. So as there were increasing agricultural drawdowns, the connection was made that was then drying out the marshes and making the waterfowl more at risk to botulism. And so duck clubs started constructing dikes like on the north end in order to be able to capture water, and they wanted to ensure that they had sufficient water to be able to establish the habitats that were otherwise drying out. And so, and that's one of the reasons why the Bear River Bird Refuge was configured the way it was with all of those dikes, was to create these freshwater impoundments that were considered to be an antidote to botulism. And, as Andy said, the Bear River Bay was considered so critical to western waterfowl populations that there was a concern in California and other states that all of the ducks were coming to the Bear River Bay dying of botulism, and it would adversely affect waterfowl hunting throughout the entire western United States. So the initial money for the first study that was done of the feasibility of the Bear River Bird Refuge actually came from a group of California duck hunters. So I don't know if that answered your question at all. Probably drifted off topic a little bit.
I'm going to bring you the microphone, sir.
I just wondered if botulism was contagious and if it posed a risk to other species in the water system.
It did. One of the things Wetmore did, I think he found, I have to look at the number, it's in the article, but I think he found 29 or 30 or something other species that are affected by this. Avocets, your black-necked stilts, were very hard hit by this. Shorebirds and whatnot. Pretty much anything that would have a chance of eating, any invertebrates, midge larvae, or water boatmen or anything like that. Again, it's a challenge figuring out exactly how this gets into the birds themselves. There's maybe a few theories that are being tested even right now. Die-offs of invertebrates, if the water dries up and you've got all these midge larvae that die, and they have somehow picked up the toxin from the bacteria, then the birds eat the midge larvae that are dead. It's very well known that if a bird does die, then of course the flies come in and the carcass gets infected with maggots, and those maggots pick up the toxin, and it can be so concentrated. One maggot can carry enough toxin to kill an adult duck, and a carcass can hold thousands of maggots. And so in some of these outbreaks that have taken place, you can see just how quickly it can mushroom. But as far as something contagious to humans, unless you're somehow ingesting the toxin, you're going to be fine. If you pick up a duck that has botulism, you are not going to get botulism. You need to ingest the toxin in a lethal dose. I don't know if does that help? Please.
That was my question. Were people eating these ducks without recognizing that they were sick?
They did. After the first year, starting 1911, they said, well, I guess they got over their squeamishness, and they were eating the ducks, and they did fine. They did okay with that. Cooking them, I think, would destroy the toxin. They were even, I'm not sure about this, but they would find some of these ducks that could barely move and use them as decoys. This is back before there were some laws that are in place now about using live decoys. But I don't know of any cases of human botulism. botulism has several strains. This is a type C botulism that does not infect other. It's avian and limited pretty much to birds. Yeah.
My question is, did these die-offs begin in 1910, 1911, or is there any historical record of this happening before that? I mean, why all of a sudden did we start having the botulism show up every fall?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are records earlier, just not in those numbers. The earliest account we have is pretty firm, 1896, but there's anecdotal evidence. People would say, yeah, I remember, out in 1870s, 1880s, we'd find, a couple dozen dead birds that way. So it's always around. That bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, is just part of the biome, the microbiological biome of the marsh. A marsh is just chock full of bacteria. A marsh that's working right. They estimate that in 1 gram of mud, 1 gram of mud at the Bear River Marsh contains 1 billion bacteria. Now, they're not all Clostridium botulinum. It's a very complex little community of microbes, but it gives you a sense of what's out there. I mean, it's just a bacterial mat, essentially. It's square miles of bacteria. And so this is just part of what's there. And this is the question. Why, some years, 1996, there were hardly any deaths. 1997, 400,000 birds died of botulism. And they're trying to figure out exactly why. And it's not, I mean, we do know that when you disturb, if you look historically, it's interesting, Wetmore thought that low water created a situation where the disease would proliferate. Looking at this historically, John Cadlick up at Utah State has found that most botulism outbreaks actually take place in years of high spring rainfall and high summer rainfall and high water flows from the Bear River. The exact opposite of what Wetmore was actually hypothesizing. And figuring out what it is that stirs this up from one year to the next is an ongoing research question.
Is there a causation or a correlation between the mosquito outbreaks and flooding these wetlands for duck hunting?
The mosquito outbreaks?
Yeah, I mean, so you talk about botulism being kind of like in that layer of the mud and everything,
Yeah.
right? But mosquitoes tend to lay dormant or lay their eggs, and then when the fresh water comes in, they are able to then hatch and spread.
I have not looked at that. I would assume so. I mean, every year they tell me to dump the water out of any bucket that's lying around in my yard because a mosquito will find it. So I would assume so. Do we have any abatement people here who could answer that better than I? Greg?
Well, I just wanted to point out, you don't see these birds as the temperature cools and the water cools into the season. Early in the season, you can see botulism birds, but as we like to hunt when it's colder, you don't see that at all.
It seems to peak August, September, and then starts to calm down. And that is another thing, along with the high inflows and high water, warm temperatures also are part of the fact. We're figuring out the factors, the physical factors that lead to botulism outbreaks, but exactly what the fine-tuned mechanism is still a big question.
Mine is more of a general ownership question in the wetlands around the Salt Lake. So I'm not sure who would be best to answer this, but my question is about Native American history and more so ownership that Native Americans have had along the edges of Salt Lake, and even the current status of if there are any tribes who do possess some private land of theirs along the shores of the Salt Lake.
I'm not specifically aware of any tribe that has any ownership. along the shore of the Great Salt Lake, but I know when I've talked to a lot of people who have basically grown up in the marsh because their families were caretakers of a duck club or something like that, they quite often have like jars full of old arrowheads and different things. And in fact, one person reported to me that when the lake would be at low levels and things would dry up out there and the sun would hit it, it would look like diamonds glistening on the bed of the Great Salt Lake. And as they would go out, each one of those diamonds was actually like a flint arrowhead. So native peoples were extensively hunting and living on the margins and in the marshes of the Great Salt Lake because there were eggs there were ducks to catch, different things like that. But in terms of ownership, I'm not aware of any specific ownership.
Okay, I know the Comodo band of the Ute tribe were close there. They were along the Weaver River, and I could see them going up there, and the Shoshone as well, going through up there. I just didn't know if any of these duck clubs had encounters with these tribes, and who's going to be duck hunting and which part.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. I know there were a number of complaints in the early records. People would be gathering eggs, in the spring and the summer months, and a lot of those were native peoples who were just accustomed to doing that. I mean, that's one of the things they had done to live during the course of the year, and so sometimes people would be mentioning that or complaining about it.